America's center of power changed, and with it, the dynamics of the political landscape. The consequences will reverberate locally in Florida. And social issues. Now, News4JAX goes beyond the headlines with political analysts. America's center of power changed, and with it, the dynamics of the political landscape. The consequences will reverberate locally in Florida, on Capitol Hill, and on the global stage. Voters demanded change on the issues that mattered most: the economy, immigration, and social issues. Now, News4JAX goes beyond the headlines with political analysts who provide unique context and perspective. Experts focused on the issues making headlines. This is Politics and Power.
In 2004, when John Roberts was confirmed to the Supreme Court, he promised he would act with judicial constraint. 20 years later, there are questions whether he's bending a knee to the Trump administration. Jurists and court analysts say there is little doubt it has become one of the most activist courts in Supreme Court history. Without hesitating, it has overturned long-standing precedents relating to voting rights, abortions, and more. Welcome to Politics and Power. My guest is Michael Klarman. He is an American legal historian and constitutional law scholar at Harvard Law School. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So during his confirmation hearings, John Roberts agreed to be an umpire, basically called balls and strikes. In your opinion, has he done that or gone well beyond that?
I don't think any judge can really be in the business of calling balls and strikes. I don't think John Roberts truly believed that metaphor when he used it. There's simply too much injection of values into the practice of interpreting a constitution, and that's inevitable, and there's no way a Supreme Court justice can avoid doing that. They may aspire to, but figuring out whether equal protection of the law means you can't segregate schools or you have to allow gay marriage, those are questions that can't be resolved without judges infiltrating their own values into the enterprise.
Let's talk about some of the pivotal moments in the Roberts Court. The dramatic switch vote to preserve the Affordable Care Act. It was a stunning decision, Michael. Viewed only through a judicial lens, his moves were not consistent and his legal arguments were not entirely coherent, but he brought people and their different interests together.
I suspect that what happened is that Chief Justice Roberts decided it wouldn't be good for the Supreme Court to strike down the most important domestic policy initiative of the previous half century during an election year. I assume he shared the view of most conservative judges who had considered the issue, that the Affordable Care Act was so contrary to their views of what government should do that it must be unconstitutional. And he decided to vote against his considered legal judgment because he thought for the Supreme Court to line up against President Obama during his reelection campaign would simply be to put the court in jeopardy. It's not clear to me that he was right about that. The Affordable Care Act was not particularly popular until it actually went into effect and people decided that it was a pretty good idea. I think he probably could have gotten away with being the fifth vote to simply strike down the statute. It's even possible that he subsequently regretted his vote, but I suspect that's what happened.
Then you've got this, his weeks presiding over the televised impeachment trial of President Trump. Fair to say it was a political quagmire?
I don't think any Chief Justice really wants to be in the position of being the arbiter of a partisan political proceeding. Obviously, Chief Justice Rehnquist had to do the same thing in the late 1990s with Bill Clinton, and he famously organized poker parties with the senators when the trial was adjourned. He was a big card player. I'm sure the Chief Justice, the last thing he wanted was to be presiding over an impeachment proceeding, especially when the votes on impeachment lined up almost perfectly along partisan lines. But in fact, there wasn't a great deal required of him. There weren't a lot of judgments that needed to be made presiding over it. So I don't think that really risked the court's reputation as being a neutral arbiter. I think much more difficult is what's happening right now when you have a Trump administration that's challenging the rule of law and democracy left and right, and the Chief Justice has to decide how to respond to that with a concern in the back of his mind that President Trump will simply defy the Supreme Court if given sufficient reason to do so. So that's a very difficult path to try to navigate.
So that brings me to my next point. And it's going to be interesting to see how the history books address this. And I'd like to see that in the future. The most central moment to Roberts' legacy, and I've got to believe that he's worried about his legacy, July 1st, 2024, he declared the president immune from criminal prosecution. What was he thinking?
Well, I had lunch with one of my former students who clerked for him a few years ago last summer. And my student, who I think is a little bit left of center, thought that Roberts was trying to protect Joe Biden from prosecution if Trump won the election. That's not how I interpret it. I mean, given that the Supreme Court delayed taking the case and delayed deciding the case until the last minute, they essentially very well may have helped elect Trump president, because there was going to be a trial in Washington, D.C. that was going to be taking place during the election campaign. And it would have reminded voters that Trump had essentially incited an insurrection at the Capitol on January 6, 2021. And the Supreme Court essentially ensured that wouldn't happen. I think probably for 250 years, most Americans assumed that a president could be criminally prosecuted. The text of the Constitution certainly is closer to reading that way than the opposite way. There's no evidence that at the time of the founding, anyone thought the president couldn't be criminally prosecuted. I'll bet if you go back to 1974, when Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, almost everybody assumed Richard Nixon was about to be criminally prosecuted for what he had done in the White House. So if you take seriously Chief Justice Roberts and the other conservative justices who tell you over and over again that the only legitimate methodology of constitutional interpretation is you look at the text and you look at the original understanding of the text and you look at history and tradition, and if those things don't dictate a certain result, then you don't reach that result. And based on those methods of interpretation, it's pretty obvious that the President of the United States can be criminally prosecuted. Chief Justice Roberts' argument was entirely what we would call a pragmatic or consequentialist argument, which is that it's not a good idea for the president to be subject to criminal punishment. And there's a respectable policy argument that you don't want the president looking over his shoulder thinking, well, if I do X, I might get criminally prosecuted, so I'm not going to do that. That's a respectable policy argument. But these conservative justices would ridicule that form of argument in any other context. And in this context, that's almost entirely what their decision's based on. So to me, that's a pretty rank form of hypocrisy when you claim in almost every other context that pragmatic arguments are not permissible because they leave too much room for judicial policymaking. But in this context, that's the argument that carries the day. I don't think that's very consistent.
Do you think that he understood that it would change the course of the presidential election?
Yeah, they couldn't possibly have not understood that. We need to compare it to the other big decision, which they advanced argument on and decided within a couple of weeks, which was the question of whether Trump should have been disqualified from the ballot because he aided and abetted an insurrection. That's what a court in Colorado had ruled. And under Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, it certainly sounds like you're disqualified from federal office if you aided and abetted an insurrection. Now, there's a question of law and a question of fact, whether what Trump did on his January 6th speech at the Ellipse that culminated in all those people attacking the Capitol. There's a question whether that qualifies as inciting an insurrection, but that's not the basis the Supreme Court decided the case on. They ended up saying that under Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, there has to be some sort of statute passed by Congress to enforce it. But that's just a terrible argument because Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, which uses similar language, nobody has ever thought required a statute to enforce it. So that was a bad decision based on text and original understanding, and they decided it. They accelerated argument, and then they decided it within 2 weeks because they thought it would be a bad idea for particular states to be able to keep a candidate off the ballot. And then at the same time, they delayed for an additional 6 months a ruling on whether Trump could be criminally prosecuted. I think it's impossible to look at that with an open mind and not think that they knew and probably were intending to intervene in the election outcome. They certainly would have known that there was a trial that was going to take place. We don't know for sure that the trial in Florida, which was being obstructed by a Trump sycophantic judge, or the trial in Georgia, we don't know that those would have taken place before the election. But the trial in Washington, which was about the conspiracy to subvert the election, was going to take place, and the Supreme Court essentially made it impossible for that to happen. The justices can't possibly have been blind to the consequences.
If I remember right, Roberts defended the decision. He insisted that substantial immunity would ensure that the nation's chief executive could operate, I think his words were, fearlessly and fairly, free from hesitancy and weakness. But the dissenting justices said it would lead to dire consequences. Do we know who was right?
Well, as I said earlier, it's a policy argument. So on the one hand, you would like the president not to be looking over his shoulder when he's making important decisions, worried about, well, if I do this, which I think is best for the country, I may end up being criminally prosecuted. On the other hand, the opposite policy argument, we would prefer that the president not do lots of outrageously criminal things without any consequence. Now, Trump's made it pretty clear since he's assumed the office in his second term that he is flagrantly disregarding law and the Constitution. He's doing it with immigration. He's doing it sending troops into American cities. He's doing it murdering people off the coast of Venezuela, blowing them out of the water. He's doing it in his attacks on universities, which violate the First Amendment. He's doing it in his attacks on law firms. He's doing it firing heads of government agencies, including a member of the Fed. Right and left, the president is ignoring the law and the Constitution. So I would say probably if you think it's a good thing for the president to respect legal limits on his authority, it would be a good thing if the Supreme Court had not done that. I don't mean to denigrate the policy calculation made by the court. It is, like many policy decisions, a difficult one where there are respectable arguments on both sides. On the one hand, we don't want government actors to be too chilled in exercising their office effectively. On the other hand, we don't want them to be completely unaccountable and to be able to do things like, as the question was raised at oral argument, to do things like order the commander-in-chief to go and murder a political opponent. The Supreme Court immunized that. Now, I don't actually think that most of what Trump has been doing is a result of that decision. I think Trump did lots of stuff in his first term that also defied the law. I don't think he's making decisions about what to do based on any concern about criminal liability. I think the more important implication of the decision was there was not a criminal prosecution of Donald Trump taking place in September of 2024 when voters were deciding whether this man should be given the power of the presidency again. And if they had been reminded of what he said and did in the aftermath of the 2024 election and on January 6th, I think there's a pretty good chance that enough swing voters would have gone the other way.
Do you worry about the legitimacy of our democracy at this point?
Yeah, our democracy is quite clearly under attack. The president of the United States goes after law firms when he doesn't like them. He goes after universities when he doesn't like them. He has comedians fired by his chair of the FCC because he doesn't like them. He sends troops into American cities based on a thin pretext, which is being rejected by his own appointed judges, because obviously there is no threat to the rule of law in Portland, Oregon, or Chicago that can't be handled based on ordinary law enforcement. He is trying to dictate the way elections are run in the country, even though the president doesn't have the power to do it. He wants everybody to have to show a birth certificate or a passport when they vote, even though there's essentially zero evidence that undocumented immigrants have been voting in anything other than trivial numbers. He has coerced several Republican state legislatures into gerrymandering congressional districts in an effort to steal the 2026 off-year elections. In numerous ways, the president is undermining democracy and the rule of law. And it's astonishing that there is not a single Republican office holder in the country who is willing to call him on it. And so far, the United States Supreme Court has mostly been complicit in the enterprise. So the question is going to be, are the American people going to rise up in protest? That's one constraint. Federal district judges have done a very good job of striking down the president's illegal acts, but they've gotten essentially no support from the United States Supreme Court. You could imagine the markets at some point constraining the president. You started to see that after the tariff idiocy, which is also illegal, by the way, back in April. But the traditional constraints on the president, the big media has capitulated to him. The billionaires have capitulated to him. Most of the law firms and universities have capitulated to him. And most important, Congress, which James Madison assumed would be a powerful check, but he wasn't assuming the existence of political parties. And the Republican Party is gutless and sycophantic, and they're not willing to abide by their oath of office. Maybe some of them are scared, physically scared of MAGA. Some of them just think that the ends justify the means. So whatever it takes to keep the dangerous Democrats out of office is okay with them. I don't know what the explanation is. I think it's one of the most extraordinary acts of cowardice and disregard of constitutional oath that we've seen in all of American history.
Do you think that there are too many politicians who just worry more about their own reelection as opposed to the American public's well-being?
I don't know what's in these people's heads because I find it very hard to fathom this sort of behavior. I assume if you went into politics because you had certain principles, you would stand up for those principles. I can only think of a couple explanations. One is what Lisa Murkowski said, which is we're all afraid, which she meant quite literally. They are afraid of the MAGA mob being sicked on them and their families. Remember what Mitt Romney was quoted as saying in the recent biography of him when he said he was going to vote to convict Trump on his first impeachment. He had fellow senators come up to him and say, well, easy for you to say you can afford $5,000 a day or $5,000 a week in security. We can't afford that. So they are afraid of the MAGA mob. Second point, some of them probably agree with what Trump is doing. They subscribe to a Christian nationalist agenda, a racially resentful agenda, a neoliberal economic deregulation, tax cuts for the billionaires agenda, and they're willing to do whatever's necessary to implement that agenda. And if it means to hell with democracy and the rule of law, they're willing to go along with that. The third possibility, they, as you suggested with the question, they're concerned about their jobs. They know they'll be primaried. Think of Joni Ernst voting in favor of confirming Pete Hegseth. Her entire professional career was committed to the value of doing something about sexual abuse in the military. And she voted for Pete Hegseth because she was threatened with a primary. And look where it got her, right? She's stepping away from politics because she's going to be primaried anyhow, because MAGA can't stand the fact that at least briefly she thought about voting against confirming Pete Hegseth. The only other possibility I can think of, and I imagine this would explain someone like Lindsey Graham, although I'm speculating. I mean, Lindsey Graham said in 2016 when he was running against Trump that Trump would be an authoritarian. And it's not like somebody has shed light on the subject and he's changed his mind. He knows very well how dangerous Trump is, but maybe he thinks that as long as he stays on the ranch, he can exercise some constraining influence. But there, he's simply rejecting the basic lesson of the 20th century, which is when you appease the autocrat, you just make them stronger. And when you finally want to intervene against them, it's too late to do it. Those seem like the possibilities to me, and I don't know which is the dominant explanation. It's probably some combination, but I just don't think most of us can fathom how somebody who went into politics with a certain policy agenda and certain principles would just give it all up.
All right. You've also got political violence on the rise. The Supreme Court just started its newest term, and some of the items that you brought up, the legality of tariffs, voting, the ballot boxes, things like that, are issues that they're going to be taking up. The right of representation for ethnic minorities. Do you think the Supreme Court is going to acquiesce to the Trump administration?
Well, I would distinguish between the Trump cases and the rest of the docket. So I do think they will gut the Voting Rights Act. They've already significantly undermined it, and that's part of their agenda of pushing in the direction of not allowing the Constitution to be used to achieve racially conscious ends. So they gutted affirmative action 2 years ago. They've undermined both of the main substantive provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And I think what they're likely to do now is to undermine the way the Voting Rights Act has been used in the last 40 or so years in order to enhance minority political representation. So before 1980, there were almost no black or brown people in Congress. Today, black and brown people are represented in significant number. And I think the Supreme Court will probably say, look, we're not going to let you draw lines in order to enhance the representation of African Americans and Latinos. And I think that's a terrible thing. And I don't think it's justified based on their usual methodology of interpretation. They also have, important cases involving other issues, the question of excluding transgender kids from sports teams where they're trying to compete on a team that's not the same sex as their sex registered at birth. These have nothing to do with the Trump administration, but they do have a bunch of Trump-related cases. So they're going to have a case with birthright citizenship. They have a case involving a challenge to the constitutionality of the tariffs. Most of what they did on their so-called emergency docket was to give the Trump administration victories by overturning district court decisions that had enjoined Trump administration policies, but without giving an explanation of why the Trump administration should be released from those injunctions. And you don't know what an unreasoned decision that simply says lower court decision is reversed. You don't know what the basis of that is. It could be on a procedural rationale that the person who brought the lawsuit didn't have enough of an interest to be a proper plaintiff. It could be because they brought the lawsuit in the wrong court, or it could be because the justices agree on the merits that what the administration did was lawful. I think most of us who follow the court still don't think there's much of a chance that 5 justices will think the president can abrogate birthright citizenship by executive order. Yet when the case got to the Supreme Court on the emergency docket, they overturned the lower court injunction on the grounds, this is procedural and kind of technical, but the lower court had issued a nationwide injunction, and the Supreme Court said, in general, we don't like nationwide injunctions issued by district court judges. I don't think we know for sure what they're going to do on some of these cases. They have another case involving whether President Trump can fire a member of the Fed. I think the court has already suggested that they're not going to allow the president to do that, even though they've also suggested the president can fire any other member of a federal agency, but they'll come up with some, jerry-built exception for the Fed because they think that allowing the president to pressure the Fed into depreciating the currency is a terrible idea. another policy decision masquerading as constitutional interpretation. We don't know what the court's going to do.
Precedent used to be an arbiter of things, but Clarence Thomas made it clear that he doesn't think that means anything anymore either. With John Roberts hitting the 20-year mark, do you find it ironic how relevant Trump versus the U.S. remains today, and how many pivotal moments Roberts' tenure intersects with Donald Trump?
Right. So, it's not, Roberts can't control who's president when he happens to be on the Supreme Court. And since Trump is presenting a unique threat in American history to democracy and the rule of law, obviously it puts the Supreme Court in a very complicated position. I do think the Roberts Court enabled Trump. Nobody knows for sure what would have happened had the trial been going on the same time, but I think it's plausible that it would have cost Trump the election. The court tried to do the same thing in 2020. There were these cases in which Democrats in Congress and litigants, a New York prosecutor, were trying to get Trump's tax returns before the 2020 election, and the Supreme Court issued a decision, kind of a compromise decision, but the basic practical bottom line was the issue was not resolved before the election, so the tax returns were not obtained by the congressional committee or by the prosecutor. You could see that as another kind of effort. I'm sure Roberts sees it as an effort to not get the court too involved in the election, but the result is it helps Trump because his tax returns are not going to be made public by a congressional committee. It turns out the New York Times got them anyhow and published them, and nobody really cared, so that didn't matter. Roberts done a lot of big things that are going to be part of his legacy aside from Trump. So the court overturned Roe versus Wade. The court has overturned 50 years of precedent on affirmative action. The court has gutted the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court has gutted most campaign finance regulation. Under the Roberts Court, the court has rediscovered the Second Amendment and broadened it in ways that for 200 years nobody ever could have imagined. The court's done a lot of stuff. It's been very favorable to the Chamber of Commerce agenda. Basically, if you wanted a one-sentence description of the Supreme Court, it has put into the Constitution the Federalist Society agenda, and that is on some cultural, social issues, conservative outcomes. Restrictions on abortion are okay. Restrictions on campaign finance are not okay. Restrictions on guns are not okay. Most use of the death penalty is okay. But even more than that, on Chamber of Commerce issues, punitive damages for corporations, whether you can force complaints by workers or consumers into arbitration where large corporations have an advantage. On those Chamber of Commerce issues, the Supreme Court is the most hospitable to big corporations in the last 100 years. So it is an extremely conservative court which has aggressively fostered a conservative political agenda. Now, the Warren Court arguably did the same thing from the opposite direction, and I wouldn't deny that the Warren Court did a lot of liberal things in the name of the Constitution. The difference is I think the conservative justices want to insist that they're holier than thou and that they're simply reading the Constitution in a neutral, umpire-like way, and that's just rubbish. I mean, they're just reading conservative values into the Constitution the same way the Warren Court read liberal values into the Constitution.
And on that note, I've got to take a quick break. When Politics and Power continues, Roberts and Trump have not always seen eye to eye on legal matters, but fact is Donald Trump is using the court granted immunity to remake America and politics. Politics and Power continues after this break. Welcome back to Politics and Power. I'm Bruce Hamilton with Michael Klarman, an American legal historian and constitutional law scholar at Harvard Law School. Michael, to be fair, Trump and Roberts have had their fair share of clashes, but is there any doubt in your mind that Donald Trump is using that immunity he got to remake America?
I think Trump is trying to remake America. I think it's hard to know for sure, and I don't see a lot of evidence that Trump would have behaved any differently had the Supreme Court decided the immunity case differently. I don't think Trump is that bothered by the possibility that he might be held to account at some point for what he's doing. If nothing else, I don't think it's obvious that he intends to yield power at any time during his lifetime. I don't think it's obvious. He obviously has some pretty serious health issues now. I think there's some pretty obvious deterioration in his mental faculties. So I don't think that necessarily he would be able to run for reelection in 2028 anyhow. But I don't see anything suggesting that Donald Trump feels empowered by the fact that he can't be criminally prosecuted. I think he feels empowered because that's just his personality. He tests limits. He has never been really held accountable for anything in his life. He had bankruptcies. NBC saved him with The Apprentice. He engaged in egregiously illegal activity during his first term. He incited an insurrection against the government, and he was bore no accountability for that. I just don't think he's thinking, well, if I could be held criminally responsible, then I would have behaved differently. If nothing else, I never thought he was going to jail, even if the criminal prosecutions continued. At the end of the day, he would have just taken a plane to Saudi Arabia, and they would have given him, asylum. So I don't think he's emboldened by the fact that he can't be criminally prosecuted. I think he does what he wants to do. And what he wants to do is some combination of, he's always had autocratic tendencies. He ran his business like a mob boss. His view was always, there are no legal constraints except what a court will enforce. So you make a contract and you ignore the contract until somebody sues you and until a court says you have to pay damages. And even then, you don't necessarily pay. That's always been his approach. So the agenda is partly driven by his autocratic tendencies, and then partly by some combination of Stephen Miller and Russell Vought, which is some combination of racial resentment / Christian nationalism / neoliberalism, the kind of billionaire agenda of tax cuts for the wealthy, cutting the social safety net, deregulating. Right? That's not Trump's agenda. Trump's never had strong views about this, right? The Christian nationalist agenda, the guy doesn't go to church. He doesn't read the Bible. He always had liberal views on abortion, right? The agenda, the substantive agenda isn't coming from him. The authoritarianism is coming from him.
Yeah, it's interesting because I read an interview that you'd done, and you were very critical of John Roberts for, quote, appeasing the autocrat. Legacy is important to John Roberts. He always said it was about the long game. What is Roberts' long game?
It's impossible to know for sure. I'm speculating. Anybody else who has an opinion is speculating. But when I see what the court did the last term, which is give the Trump administration a victory in 80 to 90% of the emergency docket cases where usually there is no rationale given for the decision. All you know is that they are reversing a lower court decision that told the administration they can't do what they're doing. So, for example, the administration is deporting people to third countries where they're not from and where there is perhaps a risk they'll be tortured, and they are not given due process, and the administration lost on that in the district court, and the Supreme Court overturned that. Why would they do that? It's possible they think the case wasn't there on the correct procedural grounds, that it was raised in the wrong court by the wrong party, or it's possible they just agree with the administration that you don't get due process in challenging the government when they have the right to deport you. You don't have a right to challenge where they're deporting you to. You don't have the right to raise the argument you'll be tortured there. We don't know why they're doing what they're doing. I'm sure John Roberts is no big fan of Trump. I suspect John Roberts doesn't think you can suspend birthright citizenship by executive order. I'm pretty sure he thinks that you should be entitled to due process before you're sent to a country where you may be tortured. But nonetheless, the Trump administration is winning on many of these things, on the emergency doctrine. Why would that be? Well, the most plausible explanation is the Supreme Court doesn't want to get into a fight with the Trump administration where they think the Trump administration will simply defy their orders. That's always been true historically, all the way back to the beginnings of the Supreme Court. They have often behaved strategically to avoid giving the president an opportunity to defy their orders. I call that appeasement because I think it's basically the same thing Neville Chamberlain did it in Munich, which is to say to Adolf Hitler, take the Sudetenland and we'll hope that satisfies your hunger for expansion. And of course it doesn't. And Hitler comes back and decides to invade Poland and demands all of Czechoslovakia. Appeasement to the autocrat doesn't work. It just emboldens them and makes them stronger. But that's my view, that he's made a miscalculation. And I'm guessing that's the calculation he's making. I think he's just made it badly. I don't criticize him for making a calculation. I think Supreme Court justices have often taken into account things like what is the political context, right? The only reason the Supreme Court told Nixon he had to turn over the Watergate tapes was because Nixon was so weak in July of 1974. He was about to be impeached and probably removed from office. So the Supreme Court felt emboldened to challenge him. Otherwise, who knows what they would have done.
Yeah, and Mike, complicating John Roberts' life is that he has a court that can't get along. I think it was Justice Sotomayor who quoted a line from an 1882 case that said, "All the officers of the government, from the highest to the lowest, are creatures of the law and are bound to obey it." That does not seem to be a mantra that Donald Trump believes applies to him.
No, we've never seen anything like this in American history. The president disrespects the rule of law. He often says, Article 2 means I can do anything. I'll be a dictator on day one. As long as what you're doing is in the interests of the country, you get to do whatever you want. That's not the system that we've been bequeathed by the framers. There are isolated examples in American history of presidents challenging the Supreme Court, or at least individual judges. Abraham Lincoln famously defied Chief Justice Taney in a decision only for Chief Justice Taney, not representing the whole court, about suspending the writ of habeas corpus. President Roosevelt famously was contemplating defying the Supreme Court if they had struck down his suspension of the Gold Clause. But, Nixon didn't seriously contemplate defying the court. Harry Truman made it clear he was not going to defy the court in the steel seizure case. Trump is systematically violating the Constitution, right? You don't get to go after universities you don't like because they represent ideologies you disagree with. You don't get to go after law firms you don't like. Don't get to fire inspectors general and all these civil servants because they're not willing to enforce your will. He's done many dozens of unconstitutional, illegal things. And so far, not tremendous resistance, except from the lower court judges who are doing an heroic job trying to stand up for the rule of law. But the Supreme Court has made their life more difficult. And some of the justices actually have had the nerve to accuse the district court judges of defying the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court has been issuing decisions with no rationale, literally no rationale. So it's hard to tell what the meaning of the decision is.
John Roberts is the Chief Justice. It's been a long-held belief that the Supreme Court is the Chief Justice's court. That's what I was taught when I studied the court. Is the court in this day and age the Roberts court, or given all that's going on, in your opinion, the Trump court?
It's not the Roberts court. It's a
loaded question.
It's not the Roberts court, but I don't think most Supreme Courts are controlled by the Chief Justice. I don't think it's the Trump court. We don't know that for sure, because I think the Supreme Court will stand up and not allow Trump to do things like suspend birthright citizenship by executive order. And I don't think they'll allow him to fire Lisa Cook from the Fed. And at the end of the day, they didn't allow him to throw out Venezuelans under the 1798 and Alien Enemies Act without due process. They're not rubber stamping Trump. I do think there are justices who would rubber stamp Trump. I can't think of anything that Clarence Thomas or Sam Alito would stop the Trump administration from doing, but they're not a majority of the court. There is a center to the court. It's just a very far right center, which is Amy Coney Barrett, Justice Kavanaugh, and Chief Justice Roberts. And we'll find out this term a little bit more about what they're willing to let Trump do. I don't actually think those people probably voted for Trump. Assuming they voted, I think they would have preferred somebody else as the Republican nominee. I'm not saying they voted for Harris. That would surprise me. But they would have preferred a different Republican nominee. However, they are making a calculation that Trump Trump would defy them if they stand up too robustly against him. And so far, they've preferred to push that down the road. And this term, there will be some instances where, the rubber will meet the road, and we'll find out exactly how far they are willing to go to accommodate the president.
Michael Klarman, we started off talking about how history will take a look at this court. Time will tell. Appreciate your context, your perspective, and focus. Have a great day.
Thanks very much for having me.
And we appreciate you watching Politics and Power.
See why every day more people are choosing News4JAX, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.